The degradation of the silver content of the denarii began with a 10% reduction under Augustus in the 1st century BC and ended with a 95% reduction under Gallienus in the 3rd century AD. Naturally, commerce slows, production declines, trade routes shrink, trust erodes, hoarding increases, and blood replaces money as the currency, which leads us to the Dark Ages. Cultures that are becoming civilized, peaceful, and prosperous grow their own trusted money. And never forget, decivilization coincides with the debasement of money, but monetary devaluation is the symptom. It is the clue. It is the warning. The disease is the desire for unearned wealth and power. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Moneyball Method Podcast. This is Mark Shupe, the author of the Moneyball Method, a Middle-Class Manifesto for objective investing. If you tuned in last week, we treated you to a little bit of history of money and the various civilizations through ancient history that used different forms of money, from agricultural to precious metals, and tried to describe what their monetary system teaches us about their society, their culture, their political structure. And I'm going to continue that conversation today, beginning with classical Greece. In other words, ancient Greece from antiquity, beginning in about the 5th century BC. We ended the last podcast discussing the Lydian slater, a form of money that didn't need the reputation of the parties to the transaction to vouch for its purities or guarantees, and didn't need the power of armies guarding the collateral in storage. The most sound and stable money is trusted across borders and across time. It is never devalued through debasement or through oversupply. In fact, stable money will reduce transaction costs to a bare minimum because the cost of producing the money itself is so high. With weight, purity, and portability assured, commerce will expand and evolve, and societies of contract will replace societies of power and social status. Because last week's podcast ended with pre-classical Greece, the 7th century BC, today's podcast will begin with classical Greece, or roughly the 6th century. In fact, money helped with your personal identity in that culture because Greek coins were minted with the emblems of your city-state, not anyone who ruled over you. Money was your civic identity. The owl was for Athens, the turtle was for Aegina, and this reflects a world where political authority was municipal governments rather than dictatorial. This was fundamentally a republican concept of money and personal sovereignty. The tetradrachm of Athens is the prime example. The Athenian silver coin became the trusted money of the Mediterranean Sea. The silver had consistent purity because of the Laurian mines, and it did not need the military to enforce its use. This points to a market phenomenon, a society deeply embedded in long-distance commerce where money had to work voluntarily across political boundaries. But as you know, money is production and production is money. The tetradrachm of Athens was money in circulation because producers were creating value. And this begins at the local level. The civic space in Athens was the agora, and the fractional coinage used there enabled retail trade among ordinary citizens. In fact, Greek democracy allowed for the economic independence of small manufacturers and shopkeepers, and these small bronze and silver fractions of money allowed for an unusually high degree of political participation. Political freedom is economic freedom. Later, discussing Hellenistic Greece, as usual, war changes all of that, and with the Macedonian conquest of the silver mine region, and eventually Athens itself, the silver content of the tetradrachm fell by 20% to less than 14 grams of silver. Eventually, power was handed to Alexander the Great, whose great teacher was none other than Aristotle, and the tetradrachm was eventually restored to almost 18 grams of silver. And with Alexander's conquest of Persia, refined gold was added to the money in circulation. These replaced the naturally occurring alloy known as electrum, and the average weight of a Greek gold stater was 8.5 grams. With the help of sound, hard money, Alexander the Great was able to expand his empire from Macedonia to India, and imitation gold staters appeared on the frontiers. However, these were also minted of gold and did not devalue the money supply. What ancient Greece did was to affirm the influence and importance of sound money to people far outside the political boundaries. In fact, the very existence of America today does just that. Now I'd like to move into Republican Rome. Not surprisingly, the monetary evolution of Rome also tracks its political transformation and does so with amazing precision. Before emperors, the Roman Republic operated on a bronze standard for much of its early history, and this was fitting for an agrarian society where wealth was land and cattle and not trade. As an alloy of copper and tin, the purity and reliability that would have been demanded by wide distribution was not terribly important. But in the 3rd century BC, the silver denarii was introduced for the Second Punic War. Rome needed to pay its armies across the Mediterranean. In this case, the military necessity of soldiers in foreign lands drove monetary sophistication. Moving into the Roman Empire, with the rise of power of emperors, a trimetallic system of money was introduced for the first time in history. In circulation were the aureus in gold, the denarius in silver, and the sestertius in bronze. But unlike the Greek precedent for municipality and citizenship being the emblems of the coin of the realm, the images became the emperors themselves. Naturally, this political absolutism led to monetary devaluation through debasement. For one thing, the minting of money was intended for military needs, not commercial transactions. And like today's progressive destruction of money and liberty, the debasement was slow. The degradation of the silver content of the denarii began with a 10% reduction under Augustus in the 1st century BC and ended with a 95% reduction under Gallienus in the 3rd century AD. Naturally, commerce slows, production declines, trade routes shrink, trust erodes, hoarding increases, and blood replaces money as the currency, which leads us to the Dark Ages. In fact, even worse than that, long-distance trade in Western and Northern Europe collapsed. Urban markets disappeared, and coined money, to the extent that it existed, was hoarded to fight wars and pay ransoms. Like ancient Egypt, landowners extracted grain, livestock, and labor from the serfs and slaves that worked the land to the extent that was possible. In return, the serfs received protection to the extent that was permitted by war. In fact, nearly everyone in the West lived in fear of highwaymen, wolves and bears, injuries and severe weather, and marauding knights. Yet at what had been the Eastern Roman Empire, also known as Byzantium, maintained the solidus coin for over 7 centuries. It was a historically long period of stable money accepted by traders in the East, from Russia to the Italian city-states. The emperor in the East had control of the mint, and the money's consistency for weight and purity was held constant, and Constantinople maintained strong urban and international markets. However, the debasement of the solidus in the 11th century tracked the Byzantine political decline, just as it had the Roman debasement and the fall of Rome that began 1,000 years earlier. Moving into the Middle Ages, the greatest stores of wealth were concentrated in the vaults of the priests, the abbots, the kings, and the dukes. And the wealth of a belted knight was concentrated in his war horse, stable of horses, armor, weapons, and his entourage of servants. Everyone owed their life to someone and ultimately to the church. But another form of wealth controlled the socio and economic culture, and that was land that produced hay. Especially in Northern Europe, with its harsh winters, the ability to maintain military horses and horses as draft animals throughout the year required a high quality of feed. Eventually, the integrated crop livestock system became more productive per acre than any other agricultural regime in Europe. And the surpluses it generated became the foundation of urban growth in places like Belgium and Holland. And by the 13th to 14th centuries AD, rising populations and urban demand were driving a shift in the agricultural economy of northwestern Europe, while northeastern Europe remained wild and dangerous. This led to greater specialization in animal products like beef, dairy, hides, and wool, which intensified the hay culture. And of course, the cloth trade was one of the engines of the commercial revolution. But the irony is that dried grass, meaning hay, eventually led to silver coins, as it always does. Cultures that are becoming civilized, peaceful, and prosperous grow their own trusted money. And never forget, decivilizations coincides with the debasement of money, but monetary devaluation is the symptom. It is the clue. It is the warning. The disease is the desire for unearned wealth and power. When the virtues of money and wealth creation are demonized in favor of the common good by faith and force, the rest is history. And that is my brief summary of the history of money from classical Greece through the Middle Ages. And I hope you join me next week when I move forward several hundred years and discuss Bitcoin, central bank digital currencies, and the rise of stablecoin in the American economy. Thank you, and we'll see you next week.